Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today we're going to be going back to 1838 and looking at the explosion and sinking of the steamship Pulaski off the North Carolina coast, some 40 miles off the North Carolina coast. When you think about famous ships that have sunk, you think about the Titanic, you think about the Lusitania, maybe even the Edmund Fitzgerald. But a lot of people, of course, are unaware of the Pulaski steamship that exploded and sank off the coast of North Carolina about 40 miles, I think, in 1838. And Chris, it is a fascinating story when you really start digging in, not just simply what happened to the ship, but some of the people who were on it.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, off the air, we've talked about this area being known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, where there's been a lot of tragedy. A lot of different types of vessels have sunk due to the Gulf Stream that kind of flows right around there, to a lot of the way that the Earth is established in the Atlantic Ocean. And this really is a fascinating story because when I started researching it and studying it, I saw a little bit about everything. And there's things about how it took place in the past, with the actual accident itself. But then there's things for us that we can gain from this, and as far as the modern day, because it was really through this disaster that we started seeing individuals and organizations come together and recognize that there needs to be new safety measures put in place with boats and vessels as they're traveling amongst the seas. And so we find in this a lot of modernization that comes in the way that passengers would travel, but also there's some great insight into exploration, into recovering these tragedies and learning about them through deep sea dive missions. So it really is a fascinating story.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the Pulaski and exactly what happened. It was a steamship, which, I'm not very familiar with how steamships work, but I know there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of steam. It can be a risky type of engine to run a ship at this particular time. There were explosions. I think earlier on in our series, way back when, we did a episode on an explosion of another ship. Was connected with President, I believe it was President John Tyler. So these type of explosions, they happened. And of course, I think the most famous one was the Maine down in Cuba, in the Havana Harbor. It exploded, and while the United States at the time claimed Spain had destroyed it, most likely it was due to an engine explosion. So, these ships were not always the safest things in the world, and a steamship like the Pulaski certainly fell into that category. It was one of four ships that was operated under the Savannah and Charleston Steam Packet Company. And in this particular journey, it had left, um, I believe it had left Savannah on June 13, 1838, and it had stopped by Charleston. And it's on its way now. It's left Charleston. It's on its way to Baltimore, Maryland. The captain's a guy by the name of John Du Bois. It's got a crew of about 36 people, about 150 passengers. Many of these passengers, very wealthy people. As we're going to see, these are some elite people who were on this ship. Uh, the evening of the 14th, everybody's, having a good time on the ship, doing what people do on ships. And it's about 40 miles off the coast of North Carolina when there's a huge explosion um, from the steam engine there in the middle of the ship. One of the two copper boilers had overheated and exploded. It killed a number of people just instantly. Just absolutely killed them instantly.
Well, and I think one of the things that's important in understanding this is that yes, they had these two copper boilers and they overheated, but really the reason that they overheated was because there were some engineers who basically, I guess, fell asleep on the job, if you will. This has taken place about 10 o'clock at night, and the location of it, it's kind of like anything. I kind of think of a pressure cooker. And if you don't monitor it and if you don't watch it, it will overheat. And then when it overheats, that combustion causes it to explode. And the location of these boilers on the steamship, I mean, it basically explodes right there, and
Mhm.
individuals are scalded to death. And it is just a terrible tragedy that kills the captain, a majority of the crew, and then Ray, what happens is if it did not kill you then, due to this large explosion, the ship begins to sink, and I think it basically went underwater within 45 minutes of the blast, which is just extremely quick, and you really do not have a lot of time to process what is going on, then to come up with a solution. You have to understand it's 10 o'clock at night. Most of these passengers have gone to bed, and maybe they had been, as you said, people on ships do what people on ships do. I mean, maybe they had had some drinking. Maybe they were just not fully aware of what was going on. So when you have the explosion, you first of all have to figure out what's going on. Second of all, you have to think about what do we do? And then third, and this is the biggest problem, is that the ship, while it was beautiful and it was elegant and it was for the rich and the upper class, it had no strong safety measures in case there was an accident of this sort. So when the ship explodes and these passengers try to get ready to say, okay, how do we figure this out? The water is coming onto the boat is slipping beneath the waves, the lifeboats are launched, but they didn't pass inspection. They were just there just to kind of get there. And all of a sudden, people find themselves in the chilly waters of the Atlantic.
Yeah, and the thing is that there were you mentioned the bad safety measures. There were four lifeboats. Two of them were junk. And when people started getting into them, they just sort of fell apart and the people went into the water and they were literally just grabbing onto anything they could grab onto. And luckily, in 40 miles out in the ocean, even in June, it's still going to be cold water. But luckily, it wasn't a situation like they had with the Titanic where it was just absolutely freezing water. But when the passengers went in the water, they didn't die from freezing to death or anything like that. And by the way, Chris, I love the pressure cooker example. I just I love that example. That was a great example.
Yeah, well, it had been brewing for some time, and then it just kind of exploded and threw my
Yeah.
mind, and there we go.
Yeah. So one of the passengers on the ship, and by the way, there were some very wealthy, high society people on this ship. We may talk about a few of them. One of the ones I want to talk about was a guy named Charles Ridge. Ridge is from New Orleans, Louisiana. He's on the ship. Again, he's a wealthy man. This is somebody who, is high society. He ends up in the water and he uses some rope he found on deck. And he sort of uses that rope to tie together some pieces and he's able to create a float out of it. Two empty rum barrels, a sheet of canvas, and some other things to create this raft. Now, the raft is big enough for two, and he's floating along and soon after that, here comes up a lady called Sally Onslow, who's a lady in her mid 20s. She was a first class passenger aboard the boat, and he helped her on the raft. Um, he helped her on the raft and the two floated there together, Chris, and I think they spent like 3 nights there on the raft together, and eventually he proposed while on the raft floating around in the Atlantic Ocean before they were rescued, and she accepted his proposal right there on the Atlantic after the crash.
Yeah, and I think about that story, and I mean, we're all familiar with Titanic, but like this is truly a made for the movie story because you have this individual who saw this girl from a distance and he said, "Well, I'm not good enough for her. I can't do anything. This isn't going to work." And then they find themselves uh, latched on to this makeshift raft that he is the one that comes upon. And as they spend those 3 days and 3 nights, I mean, she then begins to say, "Well, this is my uh, Prince Charming who has come to rescue me." And it is amazing, yes, that in the midst of devastation and tragedy, that there is a marriage proposal in 40 miles off the coast of North Carolina. And she says, yes. Now, what's interesting is the rest of that story because,
Mhm.
excuse me, help arrives. There is a boat that comes and picks up, I think, like 30 survivors. And while they're recuperating on the ship, Ridge says, "I need to tell you something. Now that we're safe, I just lost everything that I had." Now, for some reason, this man had brought like all $25,000 that he owned in his name. He bought it on that boat, and it's gone. And so now that they're on this rescue ship, he looks at her and says, "Okay, listen, things were different out there than it is here. I don't have any money. I'm a second class. You were in first class. I you can get out of this engagement. That was like emotion. You can go ahead and say no and we'll move on." And she goes back to him and says, "But oh, and just this powerful moment where they lock eyes and she says, 'Don't you remember what you told me on that raft that we will either live or die together?'" And she said, "I'm not worried about all that money. That money doesn't matter to me." Well, one thing she hadn't told him yet is that she was heiress to a $200,000 family estate, which is like worth
Mhm.
$3.5 million today. I mean,
Mhm.
all of these things he had no idea.
Of course, the money didn't matter to her. She didn't need it.
No, she didn't need it. And yet there was love found on a makeshift rum-barreled raft. And it is true, it's just a powerful love story. And basically they settled down in Baltimore. And I think they have a successful business on the waterfront and life is great. And it just kind of goes to show that even in the midst of this tragedy, there was romance and there
Mhm.
was something good that came out of this.
All we're missing is Leonardo DiCaprio and what's the lady girl's name? Lady's name?
Yeah, I think Rose was her name in Titanic. I have no idea who the
Yeah.
actress was, but I just
That-
remember them on the front of the boat with the arms outstretched and some song going on, and me thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is not really, I think, how things were with the
yeah.
Titanic." But it was this steamboat was basically the Titanic of its era.
Yeah. It was. I mean, you could definitely see some parallels between the Pulaski, I have a hard time saying that name, and the Titanic. Both are ships that very wealthy and some well-to-do people are traveling on. Both are ships that suffer an unexpected tragedy in the middle of the night. And I guess especially with the story here of Charles Ridge and Sally, her last name was Onslow, Sally Onslow. You know, you could sort of see this romantic angle, I guess, to the story that it's got that twist to it. I'm sort of amazed that this hasn't been made into a movie or something, but it just, I guess, over time it's just been overshadowed by, the sinking of the Titanic and the Lusitania and of course the Edmund Fitzgerald. I was just listening to a song about the Edmund Fitzgerald. So, these other sinkings and disasters have, I think, overshadowed this one to some degree.
Well, I think it's overshadowed it, but also I think, once again, this is history you didn't know but should. And just recently, we're talking like 2018, people, divers and salvage divers are just now starting to find the wreckage. And as they start finding the wreckage, they start seeing all of the valuables and the different things that were found. I think they have found some of these things like beyond where the actual wreck site was reported. And they're having to go down like in 115 feet of water, and they're starting to find like watches and coins and candlesticks. So I think that this newer research is leading to a greater discovery. And who knows? It might be that James Cameron or Steven Spielberg or whoever one of these high-ranking producers are going to listen to our podcast and say, "Oh my gosh, what a great concept." Actually, it would probably be what's that guy's name? Nicholas Sparks or something. He writes those
Yeah, yeah.
romantic
South Fork.
books right off the coast of North Carolina.
Yeah.
And so maybe this is the moment that they hear our podcast and say, I'm going to make a movie about this. And maybe you could be, who knows? This might be the day that you wind up, Ray, as being the actor of Mr. Ridge, and you get to confess your love to a damsel in distress, and then life will be happily ever after. Wouldn't that be great?
No, I would probably drown trying to make the raft. So no, we probably wouldn't have that. Uh,
Hence the reason he will not be part of a Nicholas Sparks movie, but more of a
no.
Stephen King movie.
Now, I'd be the grumpy man on the porch in the Stephen Spark or Nicholas Sparks movie. Another guy on the ship who I might actually be able to play was a guy called William Rochester. Yes, the Rochester family of New York. He is actually named, or the city of Rochester, New York, is named after him, William Rochester. Uh, um, he served during the War of 1812 as an aide-de-camp under General George McClure. He studied law under Henry Clay himself, the big Whig politician who played such an important role in American political history, starting really, I guess you could say in the 1820s, 1830s. So this is a family, the Rochester family. William Rochester was on the ship that is deeply embedded in American history and the War of 1812. Unfortunately, though, unlike um, Charles Ridge, William Rochester does not survive the accident. He's one of the many people, even upper crust of society people, who were killed when that engine exploded. And Chris, you were talking early on about some of the changes that had to be made, safety changes that had to be made when this disaster happened. We see that even today. I remember a few years ago, there was a new type of airplane. I think it was being flown by Boeing. I can't remember. And you had like two major crashes related to the same problem. And of course, they began investigating, trying to figure out what was causing that. And they had landed and grounded all of the planes of that particular type for a period of time. We saw it, after Space Shuttle Challenger with the O-rings. NASA made changes. They made changes after the Columbia disaster. So we see that every time there is a disaster, a high profile disaster, especially, people start making changes. They start going, okay, maybe we need to change how we're doing this or how we're doing that. I'm thinking in American history, the was it the shirtwaist factory fire in New York, where, the workers, mostly immigrant women, were locked into this building, and it's a multi-story building. And it's sort of reminiscent, unfortunately, of 9/11, where people were literally jumping out of the building, the upper stories, trying to get away from the fire. So it's like every time a major disaster happens, we sort of have to come to that disaster point a lot of times before we start making changes to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, and I think that that's the important thing about studying these stories and hearing not just of the tales of heroism or of tragedy, but also how can we make it better? And I think in everything that we do, we have to always find ways to make it better. And as we go through these different podcasts, we're always intentional about taking it and looking at it from the past as far as what happened, the stories of what took place, but then tying it into that history you didn't know but should, because when we get on these boats or when we get on airplanes or when we get in cars, we think about the selfless acts of others who've paved the way for these safety features, for these newer modes of transportation that allow us to be able to travel to and from more safely today than we have in the past. You mentioned about the space shuttle, and we are now recording this podcast when there's been a historic launch to the moon again for the first time since the 1970s. And so we see that the results of things in the past have made improvements for things that lead to great accomplishments in the future. So I thought this was a really good podcast. I do hope somehow, some way that it does make its way to a big screen or something, because I think it is a powerful story that just took place 40 miles right off the coast of North Carolina.
And as we saw here, just in just a few minutes, we looked at two people very briefly. You have two people that, within those two people, there are two different stories that you could focus on or focus on them together. I'm glad you mentioned Artemis 2, as they call it. That's on its way to circle the moon right now. Um, and you think about the Challenger disaster, you think about the Columbia disaster, you think about other things that have happened, from the Apollo program through the space shuttle program, through other things that have been done, where NASA has learned, and other companies and nations have learned lessons a few times the very hard way, but they've learned lessons that I think have enabled the crew of Artemis 2 to make it to the moon. And not just to the moon. They are going, I learned this morning, Chris, and maybe you'll find this interesting. They are going further into space than anybody has ever done. And it has to do it has to do with when they launched. The trajectory of when they launch is going to take them not only on the other side of the moon, the so-called dark side of the moon, it's going to push them further out from the moon than anybody has ever been. So this is going to be a history making event, and it's being done, I guess you could say, on the shoulders of everybody who's gone before and the lessons that have been learned. And so today, when you get on a cruise ship, when you go on that big expensive family cruise or whatever it may be, think about all the ships and things that have come before and the lessons that have been learned from each one of those ships.
Yes, great episode, great call on finding this podcast episode for us to talk about, and I can't wait as we go forward with some of the more engaging, interesting podcasts we have lined up for the future.
That's right. Well, listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. We ask you to share this episode, whether you're listening to it on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever. Be sure to share it with family and friends, and give us a like and a comment if you so desire. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
I'll talk to you later.